thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in. So I'll just give a brief overview of kind of how I'm planning to do this. I'm going to present what I believe is my most significant research finding to date. And I'm going to do that in about maybe 20 minutes. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the time really talking about research as a process, and also even just touching on sort of how I got to be in this position I'm in and what it's like, because I think that, some of you maybe have an interest in modal logic. Probably more of you have an interest in grad school, and probably even more of you than that have an interest in also just writing papers and things well. And so I'm hoping to kind of address these interests of everybody's in a way that merely talking about my own research as a product rather than a process would not do. So here's how I'm going to share my screen. As soon as I figure out, okay. So here's how then it's, everything is, oh, hold on a second. So here we go. Here's then what this is going to look like. I'm going to give my sort of present research, then late undergrad applications, my MA and coursework, my PhD qualifying year, writing the thesis, and then what it's like applying, for jobs and submitting publications and things. I find that these things are not much discussed. It's often, as I say, it's more product than process, and I'm hoping to buck that trend. The color, there's no color coding here, by the way. I just did it so it looked less like a grocery list. Okay, so let's look at modal logic. So this is a project that I've been working on for some time, and my conclusion is that I think that there's really good reason to believe that some of these very important historical systems of modal logic not only are not using possible world semantics of the sort that was developed by Saul Kripke and others, but actually can't be modeled on those semantics at all. And I think that this is really important. It's contentious, and it's received a lot of pushback, as rightly it should, because it's really, if I'm right, it's going to shift some things. So, and here's how I arrived at this conclusion. Okay, so there we are. So we're talking about John Buridan. This is a 14th century logician who basically just rewrote kind of the whole semantic basis for modal logic on his own terms, using this idea that terms sort of extend to further non-existent possible objects. And we'll see how this goes. I should add, by the way, that all these terms I'm going to clarify, and I don't assume any prior experience with logic in the course of this talk. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. Modal logic, classical logic just deals with true and false. So Maribel, you took logic with me. We did this. So it's like, okay, triangles are three-sided is true, and it's sunny in Toronto is also true. But those don't seem to be on the same level, because it could be cloudy in Toronto, but it can't be that triangles have four sides or whatever. So these are modifications of the judgments or sentences. So humans are necessarily animals. A human being can run. A human being cannot be a donkey. And then we want to find a way of providing an assessment of the truth or falsity of these. Okay. So there's this presentation has three parts, and so first there's Buridan's possible object semantics, and then there's the Kripke's possible world semantics, and a little overview of why they're incompatible. Okay, Buridan's modal logic works with in a process called ampliation. What this means, it will get to in just a sec, but I want to give the basis, the non-modal basis first. So there are four basic types of sentence or proposition in Aristotelian logic. All SSP, no SSP, some SSP, and some S is not P. And these are typically arranged in the square of opposition, where later, and the way that these are all interrelated isn't necessary for this talk. The important point is that the affirmatives have existential import. That is to say, they presuppose that the things that they're talking about exist. So this is very different from modern predicate logic, where universal affirmatives are read as conditionals. All S is P is everything, if it's an S, is a P, and that can be true if there are no S's. In this system, all of the rules or all of the existential requirements cluster around the affirmatives, and that's very different from modern logic, and this is an important point. And actually, this is one of the ways in which medieval and historical logic is sometimes easier the less you know about modern logic, because it's less confusing. Okay, so so this is the key. Is the screen, is my screen over top of some of the text in the way that you see it?
No, it's not. No.
Okay, great. So a modal proposition, according to Burden, has its terms ampliated. They are sort of extended or like stretched out. So they stand not only for the things that exist, but for things that could exist but don't. And Burden's example of this is, he has a few examples, but my favorite is, this wine I'm about to drink could be vinegar, but it's not, there's not enough time for that to happen, between now and when I drink it. And so the vinegar that this wine could be is a possible thing that doesn't exist. So take a sentence like, all donkeys are running, right? And this is true. Suppose this is true. That's because all the D's, right, are kind of contained in all the R's. All the running, all the donkeys are contained in all the runners. And that's for an ordinary non-modal proposition. And here's how ampliation works. It stretches out the meanings of the terms. So these white R's and D's are possible things that could run but aren't, and things that could be possible donkeys that don't exist. Like some, you can name them. I don't know. The status of these things is very tricky to sort out. But for this present discussion, this is just like, the omelet I could have made for breakfast but didn't, and that kind of thing. So they extend their terms to include those as well as the actual ones, since nothing impossible exists. Everything that exists is among the possible objects. Okay, so there are two axioms in Burden's system that are especially interesting with respect to how they kind of play out on possible world semantics. And it's all the possible A, every A is necessarily B, is not valid, does not entail all A is actually B, right? Because you could say all dodos are necessarily birds. It doesn't entail that there actually exist dodos that are birds, right? Since, as we saw it a minute ago, it's the affirmatives that have existential import. So that's invalid. Okay. But no A is possibly B, or every A is necessarily not B, does entail no A is B. And I'm going to show with diagrams why this works. So this is why, forget the notation. I adopted this from Paul Thom, and it's a very useful notation, but I don't want to go too far into it. I think it's helpful, but it's not necessary for understanding what's going on here. Well, both of these, right, dodos, they don't exist, but they're necessarily birds. Okay, so this, but I've made it blank to show that they don't exist. They're non-existent things. Contrast this with, suppose that all the A with the daggers is just the possible A's, and the B with the daggers is the possible B's. So suppose though that no A is possibly B, so no possible A is a possible B. From that, it does follow that no A is B, because these two, to use a slightly anachronistic term, these two supersets, the possible A's and B's, have as their proper subsets the A's and B's. And so if they don't overlap, or if they're completely disjoint, then so are all their proper subsets, as you can see in the diagram. Actually, probably the diagram is clearer than what I just said. So anyway, okay, that's one axiom. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The next one is that if all A is B, or some A is B, it follows that some A is possibly B, right? So if some glass has like water in it, then it follows that a glass can possibly have water in it for some glass. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward. And these are all well motivated by, what Burden says and what I've attempted to kind of here reproduce in a cogent way, but they get really weird on possible worlds because they're dealing with objects and not worlds. Okay, so just to show why, A's, some A's are B's, so some A's are possibly B's. Well, because these are overlapping, then their supersets overlap as well. Okay, so now, that's part one, right? Now, let's look at how we do modal logic nowadays. And the standard way to do this is to talk about possible worlds. So necessarily phi. So take phi as a sentence, like 2 + 2 = 4. And that's just the case that that just means that all worlds make that sentence true. So, and to say that it's possible that psi holds at some other sentence, like it's raining in Toronto, is just to say that in at least one possible world, psi holds. So what you end up getting is this really nice reduction of necessary and possible to the all and some of classical first order logic. So, suppose that phi is a necessary sentence. It's true in all the worlds. All the worlds make phi true, however you want to construe that. But if one makes it false, then it's not, it's like a counterexample, and so it's not necessary. Okay. More recently, people have been talking about frames, right? And so what a frame is you talk about the worlds and what worlds they can see. What counts as seeing a world is like a huge topic for debate. I don't know if I have really strong opinions on it. Often it's discussed in terms of conceivability, but that has serious problems too. Does it, like, I can conceive of a world in which, like, on the board behind me is a proof of some unknown, the continuum hypothesis. Does that mean that it's possibly true? Well, no, it's a mathematical truth or falsehood, so it's necessarily or true or false on the classical view. So, like, I don't really know what imagining, these worlds have to be something like, they can't be like model railroad villages where at some level of detail, it's just, those aren't, the dining cars don't really have food in them and stuff, right? Like it's got to be detail all the way down. Very serious problems. But what we're looking at is just the accessibility relationship. What worlds, and you can say, I'm going to just say sees, what world sees each other worlds and how the worlds are interrelated in this way. And so if let's say, take this blue sphere, or my attempt to draw a sphere to be the present world, and we'll say necessarily 2 + 2 = 4. That means that in all the worlds that we see, phi is true. And by playing around with the different relations among the worlds, you can get different axioms. That's how you generate these different axioms. Okay. The one we're interested in is reflexivity, which is that all the worlds see themselves. Now, forget the dotted lines are really there just to show that they don't matter, right? This or that world can be related to this or that world in any other way, but the point is that all the worlds see themselves. Okay, and so if it's true in this world, if necessarily phi is true in this world, then it follows that phi is also true in this world that sees itself, right? It's true in all worlds in that world's frame. That world is in its own frame. And so it's whatever's necessarily true is actually true in that world. And that's like well motivated in a way too. You'd think necessary truths have to be actual. But remember, Buridan thinks that just because dodos are necessarily birds doesn't mean there actually exist dodos which are birds. So he's going to reject this. Okay, so reflexivity, so we're going to have to reject reflexivity based on this. But then, okay, that validates the claim that A's, this little hook thing is just overlap. So some A's or B's entails some A's or possibly B's, or some possible A's or possibly B's. That's correct, right? Because if I look and I say, well, some glass has water in it, then it follows that in at least one world, right? Namely this one, a glass possibly has water in it. And that, so that we need that in order to validate this claim that actual truths are possible truths as well. But the problem is that it also makes necessary truths actual truths, right? Because if it's true in every world, it also has to be true in this world, because this world sees itself, right? So there's this tension, and the two of them come completely apart. You need reflexivity to get possible truths or actual truths, or sorry, actual truths or possible truths, but you need to get rid of reflexivity. You need it to be irreflexive to get necessary truths don't have to be actual truths. There's a middle ground, non-reflexivity, which is not all the worlds see themselves, but that doesn't get either of them. So that is, we dispense with that. So suppose if we make it irreflexive, this is the same point. So this is, in sum, this is the main thing I found, okay, is that there's no way to model Buridan's modal logic on a Kripke semantics of possible worlds. And I'll say briefly that I think that this is a very fruitful finding, if true, because I think it gives us reason to doubt what's sometimes called modal duality. So possible is defined as not impossible, that is to say not necessarily not. And necessary is defined as not possibly not, much the way that all is not some not, and so forth in classical first order logic. But I think that worlds are actually way better for possibility, because they get you events and things that could be simultaneously possible, or not compossible, not possible together, although separately possible, like that I'm here and that I'm in Spain or something, right? So those are two possibilities, but they can't jointly be possible, and worlds gets that better than objects. But I think objects get necessity better than worlds do, because if I want to know why is it necessary that triangles are three-sided, I don't think it's as informative to be told, well, it's just that way in every world. It's like, no, it's that three-sidedness is somehow necessary for an object to be a triangle, and without it, it would cease to be a triangle, right? So if these systems don't speak the same language, then our best account of necessity is incompatible with our best account of possibility, and we're in quite a pickle, which is exciting, I think. Okay, so that's the finding part. And I think I'm going to speak now. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and we'll go on to the part where I said I was going to talk about late undergrad applications and the coursework and so forth. So this is autobiographical, but I'll try to leave out as much uninteresting detail as possible. Okay, so I started out undergrad at the University of Calgary. I did 2 degrees, philosophy and English. And in my 3rd year, I did a year abroad in Spain because I wanted to learn Spanish. And at that point, my world came apart in a certain sense, because I got very interested in Latin and the history of the Middle Ages, and less interested in law. And I don't know, maybe this is a cautionary tale. Don't do a year abroad. Make of it what you will. But okay, so after that, I came back and I started studying Latin. And I decided I wanted to, after doing an honors project, I decided I wanted to continue to pursue this stuff, and especially to translate and edit unedited Latin texts and that kind of thing. And specifically ones, as I later found, which were interesting to me, were ones dealing with questions in logic and the history of how logic has developed. Because when I first started reading some of these texts, I realized that there's so many texts that are untranslated and not even edited. They're just in these manuscripts. And I thought, and many of them very significant texts as well. So that was what I wanted to get working on. So I applied to the University of Toronto, the MA program. And I also was, at this time, really quite interested in Old Icelandic or Old West Norse. And I still am, but I have decided that that's not going to be my main shtick. So, MA year, coursework, and then I applied to the PhD. The applications are interesting. I think that one of the most, I don't know because I haven't sat on a selection committee, but I think that a very important aspect of it is the writing sample, apart from like the letters and things. When I did mine, I looked at the University of Toronto, which I wanted to go to because it had this emphasis on original texts and reading things in the original language, and especially on Latin. And so I took a paper I wrote as an undergrad, and I filled out the footnotes with the actual text I was quoting in Latin and in Old English, as was the case for this one. And I didn't tell anyone about this for years because I thought it was unspeakably dishonest that I was submitting a writing sample that wasn't the same thing that I had submitted for this course as an undergrad. But it turns out that that's standard, and it was actually the prudent thing to do. The reason I'm mentioning this is because I think it's really important to kind of tailor your application to what it is you're applying to, and to really look at what they're kind of after, what they emphasize, and even also look at who you think would supervise you. But don't feel too much pressure. I really want to encourage this to think that you have to have it all sorted out. I love what I do, and people ask me, how did you know that you love what you do? And it's like, frankly, at the time I didn't. I mean, like, flashcards suck. I didn't like that at all. I like the philosophy angle, but yeah, like, so I applied for a shirk, and I ended up getting one while I was still in my coursework. And I ended up actually shifting my project, and there's no shirk police. This was the most astonishing thing. They don't come after you and say, wait a minute, this isn't what you said on your application. So feel free to change your mind about what you're doing, and to kind of explore around, and don't feel too much pressure to know exactly what you want to do. That's at least for North American schools. From colleagues of mine who are in the UK, I understand that it's quite a bit different. They expect when you start your PhD that you're going to start writing quite quickly. But here, I did 2 years of coursework before I ever went into my qualifying year and then started writing the thesis. Okay, which takes me to qualifying year. So, okay, so I think that, yeah, let's see here. So I think that oh, I want to say one last thing about the coursework. I found the experience of being in grad level seminars deeply humiliating at the beginning, because you wind up in this room and you're like surrounded by these people who are like quoting Aristotle like chapter and verse, and there are all these upper level PhD students who've been doing this way longer than you have. And I'm like, oh man, like I was used to making contributions in class and being quite outspoken and everything. And then all of a sudden I realized, like, independent of this like nice kind of structure of like a syllabus and like course readings and stuff, I kind of don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm not used to this. And so that was a really tough time for me. And I want to flag this because I think that this is one of the origins of what's sometimes discussed in like terms of imposter syndrome in grad school, is like when people get faced with like all this information and they realize that they're not familiar with it, and that's natural. That's why you're in grad school. They didn't take you on because they thought you already knew all the stuff you were supposed to know. But sometimes I think in more negative cases, people tend to veer off into more attitudes where they think maybe that the selection committee made a mistake in bringing them on at all. And I think that is untrue, and probably demonstrably untrue. But that's something to be aware of. And I was a little bit prepared for it because the University of Calgary has this, I think, really commendable practice of jointly doing grad seminars and advanced undergraduate classes, where they put you all in a room, and then the grad students obviously have different means of assessment, but you're kind of seeing that a little bit. But it was still very different when I'm like, oh, I don't need to understand what these guys are saying. I'm not a grad student, to be like, oh man, I'm a grad student and I don't understand what the people around me are getting at. So that's something I think to be really aware of. Okay, then you get into your qualifying year. I want to show, 1 second. I didn't realize I don't have it up here. When I so what you do, well, I'll just describe it because for some reason it's not up on my screen. So what they expect you to do when you have your qualifying year is, in some cases, language exams. I had to do French, German, and Latin, and they also you form a committee, people who are in some way work on stuff related to your research, often not really directly related to your research, and to find a supervisor. You write up a big bibliography, and then you send it to them and they say, why haven't you included X, Y, Z? And so then you put that on there, and then you read the entire list, and it's meant to be basically everything that's relevant to your project. It's this broad kind of field. What I did, and I strongly recommend this, is I took the bibliography once it was approved. I made all of the headings, or all of the entries, just a heading, and then I started listing little notes underneath them as I read. And then in the week before, it produced this document. I meant to have it ready to go, but it's not here, which was like maybe like 100 and some pages of just point form notes. And then I read that the week before, and I really recommend that practice. So then they sit you down, and then you have to answer questions, and they go, and I asked them, what kind of questions? Because I put Lloyd Humberstone's, this mammoth, it's like a phone book on the connectives. And they were like, don't do that, because just put specific parts, because otherwise you'll have to answer for the whole book. And that's a lot of work. And I said, oh, wow. Oh, okay. So what kind of questions am I going to get asked? And they said, specific and general. All right. So then they ask you these questions. And when they're reliably, reasonably convinced that you have a grasp of the literature, you go out and you write, right? I think, yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on this, and I want to wrap this up pretty quick. But writing, is it okay if I go to 45, Maribel?
Absolutely, no problem.
Okay, great. So writing is tough, and as you know, and I'm blessed by the fact that I really love my work to the point of obsession, and also the point that it has in some respects been actually kind of damaging to my personal life and relationships, because it's like I'm so into it, and so it comes with a negative side. But But writing, I've come to see writing as sort of an extension of speaking, and I like to speak, and I talk a lot. I read often like accounts, like Stoic accounts or like Proverbs, where they counsel on the virtue of silence, and I think that's interesting. We should have a conversation about that. I always admire people who are silent, but I've never been able to. But writing, I think one of the things that you can fall into, balance is very key. And one of the things that's easy to fall into is reading so as not to write, or letting your reading say, I can't write, I haven't read everything relevant to this yet. But now you don't want to start writing when you've read nothing, but believe me, writing and getting your own ideas out there, and then realizing there's a paper you didn't cite and checking that and then working it in is way easier. So it's a tough balance to strike. As I say, I see writing as a kind of extension of speaking, and I'm very serious about separating out editing from writing. Like I have 2 stages and they are strictly separate. One is just get words on the page, and none of this like write a sentence and then backspace and then rewrite it, that kind of thing. And then I go back and I edit again and again and again. I just go through many drafts. Yeah, and I also, so the final thought on writing, I suggest reading widely, and not just because it's sort of like, you should read widely, it's good for you, but because it really shaped my own attitude toward it in a way that I never expected. So I read, when I was developing the ideas for this presentation that I gave, I read Stephen Gould's Wonderful Life about the Cambrian explosion. And he makes the point there that basically the first thing that everyone did when they found all these strange critters was to classify them mainly as trilobites, or like things that people already knew. And it turns out, and it took a while before someone said, you know, either we're going to have to completely revise our notion of what a trilobite is, or these aren't those. And it actually turned out that they belonged to their own distinct phyla, which is really astonishing. So it completely changed the way that we saw it. And I said, yeah, I could do that. Because I think that in the discussion about logic, we're often looking for similarities in historical systems, and maybe the differences are more interesting, rather than just telling the story where it leads to this one great arc, where of course it was going to ultimately accumulate in the coming of Frege, as Geach says, which is kind of embarrassing. And and every question will be resolved. It's I don't believe that that's how it unfolds, and I don't think that that's an useful way of constructing things. I think that the important thing to stress is the differences. But I really got to that idea by reading a semi-popularish book on evolutionary biology. So I've begun to despair at the prospect of ever doing anything actually useless. I think that even these things that are so tangential often really end up relating in important and interesting ways. Okay, now finally I'm at this stage where I'm working on applications in publishing. Now, up to now I've been talking about what I did do and what I didn't do and mistakes I made and so forth. And I want to be clear that I'm not really wanting to give myself as a paradigm, because I think that certainly some of these are just opinions, and you can do things in other ways. So I'll only tell you really what I think was a mistake. And especially this stuff right now, I'm in the midst of what I'm about to start on discussing, and I don't have the benefit of hindsight. Okay, so all right, so you've written a thesis, fantastic. And now you submit it and your committee's looking at it, like, what do you do? And the natural thing is to think, oh, I should write papers because I got to get published. And yeah, that makes sense. But writing papers is very different from writing a thesis. And I wrongly thought that I could send in just basically a chapter or something like roughly structured like a chapter, and that would work. Maybe for some people that works, but it didn't. So I had to really rewrite a lot of it. And I think that the one thing that I've really found is one idea per paper. You know, a thesis chapter can explore all kinds of avenues and different things. A paper should be like, here is this one idea. That's the thing I'm going to get out. So you send them off a paper, and the first thing that I got was a desk rejection, which means that they didn't send it out to review. Someone looked at it and said, "Oh, sorry, there's sirens." What that means is it didn't. I'm going to mute my mic while these guys go back. Okay, so hopefully everyone's okay. Anyway, oh yeah, desk rejection. So what that means is I sent it in, someone like an editor or someone like a intern, whatever, looked at it and said, this is either wrong or more likely it doesn't cut much ice, so we're not going to run with this. So that's okay. But then later on, I got actually sent out for review, and I was very excited about this. The paper later got rejected, and for good reasons, but it wasn't obviously wrong or, uninteresting, right? So this was like a success, even though it got rejected. And then I got an R&R, which means they say, okay, please revise and resubmit this, which is like roughly saying, this looks good, but there are serious problems. We want you to look at this and address the things that the reviewers have said and send it back to us. So that's what I did. And I want to say that there's this phenomenon that's sometimes called reviewer two. And this was exactly what I've experienced. I've experienced this a few times now, where reviewer one's like, this looks great. Yeah, maybe you could say a little more about X, Y, and Z on page A, B, C. And then reviewer two is like, this needs to be completely rewritten. And you're like, well, so what I find is the best though is I really want to make it clear that I'm listening and I'm doing everything I can to address the comments. So what I have done is I take the comments, I put them all in a document, and I break them up by comment and by reviewer, and then I respond to them in like a very thank you for this. I see exactly what you like. I think you're precisely right if you think that they're right. And here's how I've addressed this. And I give them the page numbers. And then in the updated version, I update it with my own blue font, all the updates. And they usually, that's standard that they want you to show what you've updated. But I really like to kind of highlight it and respond point by point to reviewer comments. That all goes back. If they think that you've done a sufficient job, it's not customary for them to go, hey, we found new problems with the original one that you sent us. That's kind of, that would be, I'm sure that has happened and maybe does happen, but I think it's probably quite rare. So then it goes back out to reviewers, probably the same ones. This is based on my understanding, and then they, if they think that you've done a good job, ultimately it rests with the editor to decide whether or not to publish. And then if they decide, you get to say, oh, it's forthcoming. And you put it on a line on your CV, fantastic. And then you get the exciting business of corresponding with someone who's doing the copy editing and thinking, oh, why did I phrase it that way? And writing, oh, can you move this around? And back and forth. And then it ideally not too many times. And then it all comes out and, Lord willing, it's devoid of typos and everything. And in the lead up to that, so that's that, and then that's the ultimate sort of concluded thing. You have this published piece. And one of the ways to prepare for this, I think that's so important, is shopping your ideas around at different conferences. You can absolutely, and probably should, give the same talk more than once. And especially when I was starting out as a grad student, I was just like, I thought of talks as like, oh, great, you mean another line on my CV? I'm like, I'll go to the, CPA, and then I'll put, that I did that. And it's like, yeah, that's good. But the point of those things is to meet people and talk, and also to get feedback on your ideas so that you're developing them. So I really encourage you to see that as sort of instrumental to the process of producing finished work. Yeah, conferences are very difficult. Speaking of ways that one is blessed, I really like people, and I have no problem marching up to strangers and saying, hey, I saw your talk, and I since then have come to think X, Y, and Z, whatever. So I love receptions. I love the big groups. I love going around and talking to people, and I understand not everyone's like that. But that has really helped. And I suspect it's also partly because I worked as a server for years at a restaurant, and just got used to kind of starting conversations cold. But yeah, conferences are a tough thing, but very often a very fun and interesting thing. And I think I should end this right about now. I guess I would say that apart from this, the one bit of advice I will add is that certain things for me have been immensely helpful. One is seeing rejections not as failures. And I try to stress this in the course of describing, even getting out to reviewers is a success. And it's normal for, for rejections to be quite hard. I make a little bit of a game of it. So I'll share my screen one more time and I'll show you. So I have this document, which I call stuff in the pipeline. This is all the top secret, all my hot takes on Aristotle. And okay, so I've separated them out. I have a little key, as you can see, and I show sort of what is coming up, ideas I just had where I just jot down some notes, and things that are more like out there, or like things that I've put out, or things that I've gotten an R&R on. And I also include things that I'm no longer working on, stuff I was doing on predicates, and a hilariously bad article I sent to Oxford Studies Medieval Philosophy. And so I think that this is really crucial to developing your just to see kind of what you have all on the go. And I have another document, I'll just describe it, where I list kind of, or in this document, I list where it's gotten rejected. And I keep track of that. And I make a game of it, which is that I try to get a certain number of rejections. Not that I try to write stuff that I think is rejectable, but I say, okay, once this paper has, let's say when I get to say 5 rejections on submissions to conferences or paper submissions or job applications, I'll treat myself to something. And that way, when it comes, it's like, you're like, yeah, I mean, I'm getting rejected, but it also kind of puts me toward the goal because I'm still putting stuff out there. But rejection is inevitable. And I think finding ways of dealing with it is one of the most important things, because otherwise it can be extremely hard. Okay, that's it. So I welcome any questions, and thank you again for having me.